Welcome to FO Talks. I'm here today with Dr. Bahara Sahebi. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and a licensed marriage and family therapist. She's also co-author of Integrative Systemic Therapy and Practice, a clinician's handbook. And she's of Iranian origin, and due to the geopolitical realities of today, she's become more interested in the psychology of geopolitics. So welcome. I'm really happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being part of Fair Observer today.
Would you like to give a little introduction and a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. You mentioned that I'm from Iran. Yes, I was born there and came here as a child. And over the years, I've been interested in things related to Iran and pull away from it at different times because it carries a whole lot of pain, transgenerational pain, and because of the politics, because of being part of the diaspora. And I've noticed a lot of cultural differences between being raised in an Iranian household and being part of an Iranian community and being part of the dominant American culture. And I consider myself Iranian-American because I feel like I hold a lot of both within me. But one of the things that was very interesting to me from the very beginning was why why are there so many differences in the way we show up in relationships and we communicate. And of course, the easy answer is we're culturally different. But the more I paid attention to how the generations have changed over the decades, the more I noticed that a whole lot of the culture was shifted based on the authoritarian system that is in place since 1979 in Iran. And culture and the macro system has a whole lot to do with the way that the culture shapes and changes, and without us even realizing how we show up in relationships and in communication. So the more I became interested in that, and the more of the political climate shifting and changing, the more I've become interested in this area and looking within psychology and systemic perspective to be able to share some of those perspectives and look into these further and write and talk about them. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. I think it's incredibly important. This idea of psychology not just being individual, but something that's really shaped by your environment, the life you're in, and how that can be so systemic, and looking at that on the macro scale. So let's jump into getting deeper into that and the psychology behind it. Um, so I wanted to start with the general idea that authoritarian systems don't just control behavior, they actually reorganize the psychology of the people being controlled. So my first question is, how do authoritarian systems shape individuals' emotional life and family dynamics?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, communication is not simply information. It's one of our primary systems of emotional regulation. And in collective trauma, those who are growing up in living in authoritarian systems, they carry a whole lot of collective trauma that they may not even realize. That that reshapes families, they reshape relationships and trust and identity. So the core message here is most people think authoritarian governments just control people through forces. Like you were just mentioning, psychologically, something much deeper is happening. Over time, they reorganize how people think, how people feel, how they relate to others, how they perceive danger, how they make decisions. So eventually, fear becomes internalized, and people begin monitoring themselves before anyone else has to. And so, chronic fear, we can look at this as kind of reorganizes the nervous system, right? If we were to look at it internally from a more bio basis of this.
Right.
It really reorganizes, and the brain shifts from exploration to survival. Attention becomes organized around danger then, and then relationships become organized around safety. So emotional expression becomes organized around the consequences, not about how I feel or what I want or what I think. It becomes organized around the consequences, and people anticipate punishment before punishment even occurs.
So there's just like a hypervigilance going on.
Yes, exactly. So the greatest success of an authoritarian system is not controlling behavior. It is actually reorganizing the psychological processes that produce the behavior, and that goes beyond the borders. So people may leave the country of origin where there is an authoritarian system in place, but they carry the psychological processes with them.
Right. So how exactly is that done? What are the most specific mechanisms by which people's sort of the way they interact with one another and the way they view themselves, what specific circumstances they're internationally or within the country are doing that the most seriously and how?
Yeah, yeah. It's a great question and it's a complex one. So I'll start with how, um, because of the survival mechanism, it infiltrates political systems, enter the family system. So they don't have to necessarily do something from the outside. It becomes within the family system where parents then teach survival strategies to their
Right,
children. So it becomes don't speak, don't ask, be careful, don't tell the school we had a party last night, don't tell them,
right,
don't trust, be careful. These begin to begin as adaptive responses, and eventually they become family rules. And then eventually it almost becomes part of the person's personality, that kind
right,
of a thought pattern. So, within the past 5 decades of the Islamic Republic ruling over Iran, this regime there has been two parts of a person who has to be any person has to live through. Even when I was in grade school over there is who you are on the outside and what is safe to show, and then who you are within the family. So immediately you have this split. These are not dysfunctional families in any sense. They are adaptive family living situations under dangerous conditions.
right. So I want to talk about that adaptiveness and sort of the way that your brain has to rewire when you're in a situation like that. Why do people outside authoritarian systems tend to sort of underestimate the severe like psychological processes that happen and sort of look at it from our very limited perspective of what I would do in that situation, but we're working with an entirely different kind of brain chemistry there.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly as you said. People imagine oppression as dramatic events like arrests, violence, imprisonment. Surely authoritarian systems have more than anything. They have these components, the arrests, the violence, the imprisonments, things that we see in the news, things that we hear about. But people miss the daily psychological burden, the calculating risks, the choosing
Mhm.
every word carefully, the wondering who can be trusted, the constant vigilance. The surviving isn't only in extraordinary events like I'll get arrested. Yes, that's there. But it is in ordinary life that's lived under extraordinary uncertainties. That's the one that is the biggest mechanism here.
Wow, that's a really interesting thought. So we have sort of this dramatized idea of what this life looks like, and we're kind of imagining reacting to those big events with the current psychology of just a person living in our society. But the
Yeah.
psychology of someone living in that sort of society has been so chipped away at, so piecemeal in every little interaction, every little feeling of safety or danger, that it's just an entirely different experience, right?
So beautifully said. So well said. It's the first question to, people ask is, do you know anybody who's been killed? Do you know anybody who's been arrested? Have you ever been arrested? The answer for most people may be no. But that's when the conversation stops and assumptions are made. Well, I'm not traumatized, or it didn't impact me. And I wanted to share this, that people realize that whether they have grown in an authoritarian setting or they know somebody close to them who has, they are part of a collective trauma that encompasses the things that you just said in the day-to-day living.
Right, yeah. And I think that's you bring up a really interesting point about how a lot of people are carrying things that they don't realize. Um, you and I had talked a little bit previously, but though also about, um, over pathologizing and the danger there. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think you strike that balance of, trying to uproot and look for things that are underneath the surface without getting too much into your story and out of like living in the present and harming yourself? How do you make sure you're bringing up the right amount and not trying to look for something that isn't there?
Ah, good question. So, communication about these things are really important. It's within the story of the individual. So it's not about asking the direct questions necessarily of, did anything happen to you? Those
Mm,
may be part of the question, but it's about noticing the way that the person is over
oh,
time showing up in different or they're reporting that what gets in their way of
right.
getting close to others or within the relationships. You and I were talking offline about how authoritarian systems may resemble abusive relationships, for example, because there
Hmm.
are some similarities, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not saying an authoritarian government is the same thing as an abusive relationship. That's not what I'm saying. They are different systems operating on different levels. What interests me is that they rely on many of the same psychological processes, though.
Right.
Both are chronic relational environments organized around power, around fear, around unpredictability, uncertainty, any of that. And as a systems therapist, for me, I'm interested in the processes, not simply the comparison. So I'm not asking, how is were you ever arrested? I may, but that's not where the conversation ends. Shared psychological processes in both of these systems gradually create chronic uncertainty, unpredictability, fear of consequences, self-monitoring, emotional dependence. I don't know, so many different things, erosions of trust, even isolation, like it's not safe, so I can't tell anybody. Learning helplessness, normalization. I work with people who check in with me because they're afraid of how or what to say to their boss at work or not. It's just about, should I say that I want to take the time off because, my parents are coming in town, or should I not? It's hard to differentiate. Is that too
Right.
much information? And these are brilliant people who even have PhDs who, the system has helped them organize that in a way that they are not able to tell what is safe and what is not. People
Right.
stop asking, what do I want? They begin to ask, what is the safest?
Yes,
That's
yes.
the psychological shift.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put, and I think that that idea that people just really just ask themselves what is the safest is something that everyone should keep in mind in every facet of, I think, human interaction.
Completely, yes. That's why we talked about the how is it similar to abusive relationships. I guess we can also talk about processes in that same aspect, acclimation, internalization, even hope. So,
Yeah.
yeah, but the way that these processes are organized is that initially people notice every violation. Over time, the nervous system then recalibrates itself.
Right.
What once felt shocking becomes expected.
Can you explain why it does that? Is there a biological reason? Is there an adaptive reason for why we tend to do that?
Yes, yes. So what once felt dangerous, right? It becomes ordinary. That doesn't mean people approve what's happening. It means they have reorganized around chronic threat. And the way that the nervous system does that is through the mechanism of desensitization. Our brains are function in a way where if we are exposed to the same thing over and over and over again, we can and will desensitize from it. And this is why we talk about social media so much and the impact of what we see on social media. We can even talk about how over the decades in our country here, how we are how we show up and how we as a society are impacted by mass shootings that we hear. In 1999, when Columbine happened, how the society reacted and where we are today. So over time, it's become in a way where people are desensitized and not reacting to it in the same way because then it becomes internalized, right? Eventually external control becomes internal control for us too. So if we are talking about somebody with an authoritarian who's been in authoritarian systems, they begin to do self-censorship or anticipating punishment or monitoring themselves, remaining silent. These are long before they tell
Right.
them what to do.
And is that sort of just one of the psychological effects of the chronic uncertainty and the constant repression?
Yes, yes. And this broadens our conversation about, how does this happen? Human beings are extraordinarily adaptive. The level of resilience that we have is much greater than what we think we do collectively. So we're extraordinarily adaptive. The tragedy is that the same flexibility that allows us to survive in any case, in this case, oppressive systems, also allows those systems to gradually feel normal to us. And we don't adapt because something is healthy. We adapt because adaptation keeps us alive in many ways.
So, how do you notice those adaptations showing up in Iranians across the diaspora and people who maybe aren't living there anymore but still have those like wired patterns and trauma?
Yeah, yeah. Chronic uncertainty changes perception, right? The way that you're seeing things, you think things.
Hmm.
So trauma doesn't only change emotions, trauma changes perception. So people begin interpreting the world through that survival lens. And the way that you see it in the diaspora is there's hypervigilance becomes normal, not trusting one another. Ambiguous situations feel dangerous. So I need to know everything about you, your background, your family of origin, all of that before so that I can place you in I can place you in a category for me to assess, are you dangerous or not? Worst case thinking becomes adaptive in this case. So, you can think about it as a cognitive bandwidth narrows in a way. And then
Right.
daily decisions become organized around minimizing risks. So chronic uncertainty doesn't simply increase the anxiety, it changes how the brain interprets the world and how they show up, and it shows up in the diaspora in the degree they allow people to get close to them or keep them out, or the types of questions they ask when they meet somebody new, and things like that.
So that's really interesting. I really liked your question or your answer earlier on how you sort of unearth that,
Mhm.
and how you notice the ways in which those things that were once adaptive are now showing up maladaptively. I really like the idea of kind of looking at what's going on in your life, what are you struggling with, what is difficult for you, what is creating a level of anxiety that it doesn't seem correct for that situation to create, and then working backward from there and looking into the past, looking into the trauma, and saying what could be here that's informing that worldview.
Yes.
Um, and I think on the topic of like what people's like perceived reality and like perceived like existence is, and how that shapes how you're processing things, I want to talk a little bit about communication because there's been a lot of cutoff of Iranians from the world. And I think the ability to express yourself, and the ability to see the rest of the world is a really big part of being able to have your reality shaped not just by the most extreme that you're seeing. And that's
Yeah.
not the case for either side of what's going on. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could talk a little on that.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. Communication isn't simply just information. It's a regulation. It helps us regulate in a lot of ways. This is probably the most important idea I want people to understand. When communication regulates people, and that's what I'm saying, we regulate ourselves through relationships. We heal in the context of relationships. Knowing someone is safe calms the nervous system. So families co-regulate each other. Attachment depends upon predictability in many ways. And then uncertainty keeps that nervous system activated. So every unanswered message becomes psychologically meaningful. I
Right.
can't reach my family. The nervous system hears that, and it's like, I don't know if my mother is alive, for example. Those are two different experiences. So, this communication for 81 days, Iran was completely cut off. It was under a blackout and completely cut off by the regime with the rest of the world. So they couldn't share their videos and their experiences with the outside. Since then, and we couldn't call them either. Since then, it has been back, but as always, there are so many filters that people have to buy VPNs to be able to break through that. Well, who
Right.
can afford VPNs? It's only a
Yeah.
certain sect of the population, not 92 million people who have different living experiences. So when communication disappears, and right now, when I think of communication disappears, I still see it that way because, as I said, only a certain population can have access because they can afford
Yeah.
VPNs. So when communication disappears, as it is now, uncertainty increases, hypervigilance increases, rumors spread, trust decreases, anxiety spreads through families. And one of the deepest injuries is chronic uncertainty. People cope better with bad news than endless uncertainty.
That's
And
interesting.
yeah,
Could you
and
go into
that
that a little bit?
yeah, exactly. So maybe we can talk about that shutdowns and how they affected psychologically, right? Those internet shutdowns, they weren't technological events that were happening. They were attachment events. So people lose their Wi-Fi. It's not just that they're losing. I know. Do I know my family's safe? I don't know what's happening. And then one text, one voice message, one double check mark. And I wrote an article about that double check mark. Those become forms of psychological survival.
Oh,
Yeah.
the red
Yes.
receipt. Uh,
Yes.
So for those of you who don't use WhatsApp, WhatsApp gives you a double check mark when the
Yes.
message has been read, so you know that there's actually someone on the other end to receive the message and look at it,
Yeah.
and that they were able to.
And to answer your questions about that psychological effects of chronic uncertainty and what that does, people never know who when rules will change, who's watching, what behavior may become dangerous. The nervous
Right.
system remains activated at all times. We see anxiety, we see exhaustion, sleep disturbances, difficulty concentrating, emotional fatigue. Eventually, then survival becomes the organizing principle of daily life. And so that's how uncertainty, chronic uncertainty, can impact people psychologically, even if they're not living there, even if they're not from there, or they're a generation removed, or they haven't been.
Right. Yeah, because we think so much about like what's happening in Iran, but there really are so many Iranians here who are not able to get in touch with families and waiting for news. What is that like in your experience and the experiences that you've heard from others? That sort of feeling of silently screaming where you're dealing with all this grief and fear and
Yeah,
and everyone else is just going about life like normal. I mean, I've
yeah,
talked to a lot of
yeah.
people struggling with grief, and I think that's one of the things that I've heard is the hardest.
It absolutely is. It's living a double life on a daily basis, is holding so much grief and so much pain and uncertainty, and hope mixed with despair, all at the same time. It's anger and sadness together, showing up together, and and then having to put on a nice face and show up in public and have a conversation about the weather and the
Yeah.
Canadian wildfires and how things are. So you know and and there's another layer to it too. When this becomes chronic, there is a fracture within the community too. So you can't turn toward one another because people have different thoughts and ideas, and because their
Mm,
nervous systems are activated, they can't hear one another's perspective. When you can't reach the enemy, then you look for an enemy within who just happens to be somebody with a different thought than you, also suffering, having the same emotions, having the same anxieties, but perception is different. And this takes me to that: how does repression change perception over time? So even though we're talking about the diaspora, they're here, they're not under that repressive regime, but their perception has changed over time.
interesting.
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's carried with them. Trauma, like collective trauma that we're talking about, reorganizes perception. The neutral situation then can begin to feel threatening. So it may be neutral that me and you sit here and have different thoughts about what should happen there or what is happening there. But
Right.
it's to the nervous system of a person who has lived in that repression, that just feels like a threat.
Right. And I think we can understand that on a micro level.
Yeah,
You come home after like a crappy day at work, traffic was awful, and something your
absolutely.
partner says sets you off a billion times. And,
Absolutely.
that's sort of the experience that's happening now on, hundredfold.
Sure,
Um,
sure, exactly. So then what do you do in that situation? You're like, oh, I'm just
right,
not going to deal with it. That
right,
external event, or in this case that we're talking about, external surveillance, gradually then becomes internal self-surveillance. It's like every day when I come and say this to my partner, like you were saying, I'm just not going to deal with it anymore. I'm not going to say anything anymore. I'm just not going to tell him how the traffic was, right? So remaining silent even when it's safe, avoiding conversations, monitoring self, censoring self, or going on the opposite end and attacking the other person who may have a different view.
and I think that you've been talking a lot about that in defend mode rather than in explore mode. And I think that people tend to really underestimate the severe, like the screaming head in someone's voice that tells them just keep things safe at all times. And I feel like there's been some criticism and, people saying, why can't XYZ happen? There has to be some self determination, there has to be internal
Mhm.
revolution. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about
Yeah.
what it looks like and how difficult it is to go from the mental state of doing everything, every single fiber in your brain is attuned toward keep myself safe. How
Yeah.
we're kind of, in my view, very short sighted it is to then ask that type of person to make a huge, dangerous move.
Mhm, mhm. I love that because it's not short-sighted because that's like a very on par way of thinking about something that hasn't been experienced or lived through. So you're asking the kind of question that any human who hasn't lived in this case as an Iranian, but generally in an authoritarian system to do. So Iranians over the decades have risen up and have done everything humanly possible and have given their lives and have been jailed. And the number of political prisoners in Iran is the largest in the world, and we don't even know the full scale.
Yeah.
It is absolutely crazy how much people have tried to do generation after generation after generation has done in order to create that change. And
Right. Yeah, that's important too. The physical
yeah,
impossibility of doing that, even if you were to do it.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And millions of people have done this. But the first thing that happens is communication is cut, so the rest of the world can't see it. The second thing is mass, like there were over 40,000 people killed in 2 days in January because they rose to fight the regime and overthrow the regime. And then there's the propaganda that started after that saying that they were Mossad agents or something else so that nobody else pays attention to it. So that this is an important point because there are periods of uprising. If you look at the history of Iran, there have been periods of uprising and then periods of nothing, silence. And more as the years are going by, you see these periods of uprising getting closer and closer to one another. Now, what is this authoritarian system? How are they reshaping where periods of silence are happening? Like you're asking, then how come they're not just chronically, like just, because they are willing to give their lives. But there's the family system involved here. So authoritarian systems reshape families. Politics eventually becomes relational. Families become places where survival strategies are transmitted. So it's no longer I'm only looking out for myself. Now I have to be careful, like what's going to happen to my mother if because they come after your family members. If they catch you, they come back after all of
Right.
your family members. So now it becomes a personal and family responsibility to be careful how to talk, trust, don't ask questions, don't attract attention. Let's just say, I'm making this up, I'm not, this doesn't relate to me, but let's say that my father was involved in one of the uprisings in Iran over the years. If I were to go back, they would take me, even though it has nothing to do with me. So this is how authoritarian systems, connect that you're not the one in danger. If you want to give your life, you also have to be willing to give your entire family's life.
Right.
Eventually, that becomes identity, right? Children don't simply inherit the stories they hear, they inherit ways of organizing themselves around danger. And
Right.
that's part of how do I organize myself? I have to protect my family and at the same time leverage how am I going to give my life or show up in a way that is going to help overthrow. They are
Yeah.
very strategic about how they transmit this fear and who
Right.
do they go
Creating a
after.
possible situation,
Yeah.
essentially.
Hmm.
Wow. So, um, so we're starting to kind of get to the end here. I wanted to visit that real quick, that idea of when you get reorganized like that, and then you're in the process of deorganizing, if you make it out, if you're an Iranian living abroad, um, how can we address that in a way that yes, allows people to reorganize their cognitive processes and, create schemas and ways of looking at the world that are more adaptive for where they're living right now, and doesn't cause them to still be in this hypervigilance. How do we allow people to create that while not invalidating the real fear, the real danger, and the real threat that their brain is reacting to, and still taking that seriously and allowing those emotions that they're feeling to drive action?
Yeah, yeah. Such a good question. You brought up a very important point before um, our session, our recording here, which is related to that balance between gaslighting versus, challenging perception, right?
Right.
And how that looks. I think, first of all, it's really important to distinguish between that gaslighting and invalidation, right?
Could you give us a quick clinical definition of gaslighting? I think there's
Yes.
a lot of
Mhm.
colloquial noise around that.
Yes, absolutely. Because because they're not the same. So gaslighting is intentionally causing someone to doubt their own reality, right?
Right.
And so if in I'll talk about in context of therapy, for example, if we're using modalities such as cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy, they're not trying to do that. They're trying to reduce suffering. And your question was about like how are people able to not be careful not to gaslight. So what some people experience in this way is they experience it in this way, right? They experience it as gaslighting if it's challenged, or they're just questions that are being asked. I understand why some people, especially those from oppressive or authoritarian environments, may experience certain interventions or certain dialogues as invalidating. I can completely understand that. For example, if someone has lived in a world where surveillance was real, retaliation was real, censorship was real, fear was realistic, and then somebody immediately asks them, could this be a cognitive distortion? Could this just be in your head?
Right.
That person may feel like their lived reality is being questioned. But that's not what therapeutic modalities are trying to do. Not because if we're looking at cognitive distortion, for example, from a CBT perspective, it's not because CBT is wrong, but because context hasn't yet been fully understood, right?
Right.
So could this be in your head is not the picture here. So it is in my head, and there's an and. So this is why systemic perspectives are so important. So as individuals having friendships or coworkers or family members who've grown up in that environment, or in context of therapy where the therapist is concentrating on the individual healing.
Right.
Um, as a systemic therapist, I always ask two questions. It's not only what is happening inside the person, but also what has been happening around this person. Symptoms don't develop in their isolation. So my cognitive distortions, they didn't just happen. They didn't come out of nowhere. They develop in relationship to families, communication, institutions, culture, and political systems. So CBT and DBT kind of modalities that go into the person, they have a whole lot of value in themselves.
Mhm.
Both are evidence-based therapeutic modalities that help many people. CBT helps people recognize thinking patterns that increase suffering. For example, DBT does an excellent job validating emotional experience while teaching regulation skills to the person. Those are incredibly valuable contributions, but they're not enough
Right.
in the context that we're talking
They
about.
have to be held in
Yes.
context.
The question I would add to this is, have we spent enough time understanding whether this person's reaction are adaptive responses to a dangerous environment
Or not.
before we begin trying to change them?
Wow, that's really interesting. I love that distinction.
Yeah, sometimes what looks like hypervigilance is actually wisdom, right?
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes what looks like anxiety is not anxiety, it's actually accurate risk assessment,
Right. Wow,
right?
that is a fascinating idea. I would love to explore the topic of individual versus systemic,
Yeah.
and how to look at like a person's individual psychology in a much
Yes.
broader context, because I feel like that's been a huge conversation that we're saying needs to happen but isn't happening. So I'd love
Yes,
to have a
yes,
whole conversation
exactly.
about that sometime.
Right,
Um,
absolutely. And maybe within a minute, I can just open that lens up and as our ending. So, like, what is the
Sorry.
danger in that? The danger is that unintentionally individualizing suffering is overlooking the system. So we have to ask the right questions. How do we change this? Instead of how do we change this thought, it's more like what experiences taught this person to think this way, or which adaptations still serve them today, which no
Right.
longer do or serve them before.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, that's obviously
Yeah,
applicable on a broader scale in
yeah,
regards to very serious collective trauma
exactly.
experiences, and also on a minute scale in regards to individual psychology. And hopefully people can notice those things and apply what the mental experience of having to do something like that must be like on such a broader and more intense scale.
Absolutely. It's in pop psychology world that we live in now, where Instagram gives us all the answers. We are very much inclined to try to find one answer to every problem. There's no
Yeah,
answer. These are much, much more complex processes at play that are tailored based on the person's lived experiences. They may have overlapping themes across the board, but it's still very individualized. And,
right.
my work asks us to shift the question whether the person's a therapist or a person just curious to ask a friend about their experience living in an environment. The question is, what's wrong with people, instead to how have systems reorganized the psychological and relational conditions under the way that the person had to learn to survive, that they're showing up this way, they're
And
acting.
learn to be a person.
Yeah, that question I feel like captures the heart of
Yeah.
systemic perspective and provides a strong way to be able to have conversations with people who won't feel gaslit in a way.
Yeah, I really like that. That is a great, I think, thought to walk away from this with, a general theme of the systemic versus the individual. Um, I've really enjoyed talking to you about this in regards to the Iranian experience specifically. Um, is there any final thing you want to say on that, like part of it?
Thank you so much, Lucy. I've really enjoyed it as well. I was thinking as we were talking right now about some reflective questions I would like the audience to walk away with.
Yes, please.
Because we've said a whole lot, we've touched on a whole lot, but I want this grounded within um, a, something to walk away with and build on, and maybe have experiences and topics of communication beyond what has been listened to here. So if a person, some questions I have is, if the person is from themselves or their family comes from an authoritarian background, um, I want to ask those people, as you reflect on our conversation that Lucy and I had today, I would leave you with three questions really to ask. How much of what I call my personality is actually an adaptation to the environment that I or my family learned to survive? Um, and then another one is, in which ways of relating to others, like, for example, trust or remaining quiet, staying silent, avoiding conflict, always being cautious. How much of those still serve me today? And which ones may simply be echoing in a different world so that I can begin to let some of those guards down and it's not as dangerous anymore? How much of that am I carrying? I also want to ask what might become possible in my life if I no longer had to organize myself primarily around that survival strategies that I've built. But instead of that, organize my life around connections, curiosity, freedom. Freedom. That's a big word that captures so much of this. Now, if you, as the listener, is coming from um, you're not coming from an authoritarian background, and if you haven't lived under an authoritarian system, I would invite you to consider some questions to reflect on as well. Have I ever mistaken someone's caution, silence, or reluctance to trust as disinterest, when it may have actually just reflected a lifetime of learning that openness can be dangerous? Or maybe think about how might my own assumptions about trust, communication, and emotional openness be shaped by the privilege that I've had of rarely having to fear speaking freely. It's really easy to say, we should do this, or why don't you just talk about this, or just say it. But it's very hard when you've been organized, your survival has been organized around this. And instead of asking, why won't they open up to whatever, me, us, conversations, what would change if you were to ask, what experience taught this person or these people to be careful in the first place? You know, perhaps the most important question isn't simply, who am I? But it's more like, can I tell the difference between who I truly am and who I have to become in order to survive the system that shaped me? We're having those same kind of dialogues, starting to have them in our own country, the United States, right now, where there is surveillance around words that can be said in universities and words that cannot. We often think of self-discovery as peeling back the layer, like I like to think of it like an onion. But how many of those layers have we actually examined in ourselves? I get very afraid when somebody says that they think they know themselves. I know I don't know myself at all. I'm working through peeling the onion and, getting to know the different parts of myself from different angles. So becoming more curious, right? Which were consciously chosen and which were quietly inherited from our families, not just genetically, but culturally or historically or politically, transgenerationally, that surrounded us. I hear a lot of people who are not familiar with human development and family science and systems say, that's just my genetics. That's just the way it is. And that's like such a dismissive answer of all the different parts that you hold. If we become curious about those layers with compassion rather than judgment about ourselves or others, then we may begin to see how they continue to shape the way we trust, we love, we parent, we lead, and relate to others. And then perhaps for the first time, we can begin to choose more intentionally which layers still reflect
Right.
who we want to be.
And still serve us. Wow, that was so beautifully put. Um, this has been so meaningful to me just because it's so clear that you really do care. You just want the for better emotional experiences for people inside Iran and outside. And I really do hope that we're able to have more conversations and that through your work, you're able to create that opportunity for more people. I loved your questions, and I hope that more of us get the opportunity to reflect like that.
Thank you to you, Lucy, and Fair Observer for providing the platform for us to have these conversations. And I look forward to our future conversations as well.
Yes, absolutely. I can't wait to speak with you again, and this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you
Thank
so much for being here today.
Bye.
Bye.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.